Well, hello everyone. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Laura Portela García as keynote speaker in our symposium. Professor Laura, professor at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam, Netherlands. She is PhD in the University of Graz in Austria, and she will talk on rectifying crime justice. After that, Professor Marcos Azevedo at Unisinos will discuss the presentation. Professor Laura, thank you very much for your presence with us. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros. Por favor.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be able to present here my ideas, and I'm very sorry I couldn't do it in person. It was a bit difficult to plan a trip to Brazil at this moment of the year. So as you can see from the title of my presentation, I'm going to be talking about rectifying climate injustice, and in particular, what we should do for repairing loss and damage. Let me see. So before starting, I just want to give a brief reminder of...
Screen.
Sorry?
Ela não conseguiu compartilhar sem compartilhar as notas, então ela preferiu.
You cannot see my screen
Okay,
anymore?
no.
No.
Okay.
Please share your screen again.
Yeah, let's see. Screen. You see it now?
See, yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, cool. So I was just saying that before getting into the problem of rectifying climate injustice, I just want to give a little bit of a reminder about the international problem that climate change is. So as you all know, climate change is the result of the emissions that we emit in the atmosphere that get concentrated there, which causes high temperatures and negative effects for our societies and also for the natural world. Now, one characteristic of climate change is that it is an intergenerational problem. The effects of the emissions that we emit today, we will not materialize until the future. And at the same time, the negative effects of climate change that we see now are the result of emissions accumulated over the past centuries. So usually climate justice has been focused on emissions and their effects in the future. But rectifying climate injustice for loss and damage sets the focus in what I call here time Y, meaning the negative effects of climate change that we see today. So if we want to see it in the differences on global climate policies, whereas philosophers have been focused on duties of mitigation or carbon dioxide removal, solar radiation management, and to some extent adaptation, which deal with what kind of world we will leave to our future generations. My focus has been in our duties towards those that live nowadays among us and that have been affected negatively by climate change. So again, my focus is what I call here in time Y and not in time X. Now, what is what I call the real world problem or the policy problem? This is the problem of loss and damage. So you can see I have brought here a couple of European examples to illustrate what I'm referring to. So I'm referring, for instance, to the negative effects of global warming caused by the European heat wave in 2003, which amplified the toll that one would expect from temperature rising over the summer in Europe, or the floods in Louisiana also some years ago, or the flood flush that devastated huge parts of Germany and Belgium also a couple of years ago. All those negative effects of climate change have been called loss and damage. Now, loss and damage policies have been a bit more in the focus of climate policies since a couple of years ago, but it has not always been the case. So the topic came up the first time in 1991, and it was brought up by the Alliance of Small Island States or Small States, which wanted to create a compensatory mechanism for the negative effects of climate change that they were suffering, and particularly in this case for sea level rises. And after various attempts at different COPs in Bali, in Poznan, and in Doha, finally in the COP19, the international community agreed to create what has been named the Warsaw Mechanism for Loss and Damage. Now, what kind of things does this mechanism aim to? It aims at, according to the policy documents, it aims at enhancing knowledge and understanding of comprehensive risk management approaches to address loss and damage associated with climate change, strengthening dialogue, coordination, and coherence and synergies among relevant stakeholders, and enhancing action and support, including finance, technology, and capacity building to address loss and damage associated with the effects of climate change. Now, what exactly is needed to fulfill these functions? I identified three key aspects that are key aspects that are very relevant for the conversation on the Loss and Damage Fund, and that will help us fulfill the functions of the Warsaw mechanism. The first thing we need to decide is what will be financed. So what will count as loss and damage, and what measures are necessary to address them. Second, who will be the donors of this fund, and particularly how will loss and damage duties be distributed. And third, how we will identify where loss and damage occurs so that we can finance the rectification of loss and damage and the measures associated with them. Now, there are these three key aspects of the loss and damage fund must be addressed in a just solution for climate change. So what does a just solution look like? There are different ways of understanding what a just solution might look like. Some philosophers have focused on the distributive aspects of climate change and how we should address the harms that occur in our world without looking into any other justice aspects relevant in this context. But I believe that the anthropogenic roots of climate change must be acknowledged in the ways that we address loss and damage. And this has also been recognized by many philosophers who believe that the fact that climate change has been caused by human beings, and particularly by the global north, should be acknowledged in the ways that we propose a just solution to climate change. And this has not only been mentioned by philosophers who believe in what I call rectificatory climate justice, but also by activists and policymakers. So, for instance, Vanessa Nakatev and climate activists from Make Polluters Pay claimed that fossil fuel companies and the biggest polluting countries have the responsibility to provide compensation for loss and damage. The global north hasn't done anything about loss and damage because it has refused to accept responsibility for the climate crisis. They don't want to pay the bill. So clearly here, Vanessa Nakate is invoking the intuition that the fact that certain actors have caused climate change should be recognized in the solutions that we provide to climate change. Similarly, Barack Obama said in the 2021 in Paris. I've come here personally as the leader of the world's largest economy and the second largest emitter to say that the United States of America not only recognizes our role in creating this problem, we embrace our responsibility to do something about it. So here also Obama seems to imply that the fact that a particular actor, the United States of America, has contributed to the problem of climate change should be reflected in the way that we address climate change, namely by the United States of America taking responsibility for climate change. So all these discourses and intuitions can be put in the form of what I call a rectificatory justice intuition. So as I understand it, rectificatory justice is a kind of justice that requires acknowledging the sources of the injustice and the role of the actions leading to that injustice when deciding how to repair it. A rectificatory approach acknowledges these sources, but how? Well, by targeting those closely connected to the action as the duty bearers of rectification. And this has been the topic of the book that I have published just this year, where I have to sketch a theory of, I have sketched a theory of climate injustice and reparations for loss and damage. And what I do there is answering the questions that I referred to before when thinking about the key aspects of a solution for a policy mechanism for loss and damage. The first thing that I do is providing a definition of loss and damage based on the capabilities approach and a human rights approach. Second, I explain who should be the duty bearers of rectification by relying on an account of historical responsibility based on the polluter pays principle. And third, I provide fitting tools for developing a framework to address loss and damage, a policy framework. Oh, sorry. A policy framework that relies on attribution science and also and it's inspired by how legal practice has dealt with similar problems. So in this talk, this is what I'm going to do. I'm gonna sketch all these ideas of how we should define loss and damage and how we should distribute the rectificatory duties of addressing loss and damage, and also how a policy mechanism should reflect those ideas. If you wanna have a look at the book is open access and you can just follow the QR code. I can also send you the presentation later if you want. So let's start with what I call a minimal definition of loss and damage. Why do we need this in the first place? Well, the reason why we need a clear definition for loss and damage is because political agreement concerning this problem have been made possible only because they have been using, politicians have been using ambiguous and vague language to refer to these concepts. And this ambiguous language has been helpful to advance in the negotiations, but at some point we need to decide what will count as loss and damage, who will be receiving the funds, and what exactly will be funded for those who ought to receive the funds. So let's get into, I don't know what it's, yeah. So let's get into that. I believe that where we need to start is by providing a minimal definition of loss and damage. So a definition of loss and damage that we can all agree with, even though there might be further instances of loss and damage that are not covered by this minimal understanding. And it is a minimal understanding that at least fits the intuition that those countries that are poor and developing countries facing the negative consequences of climate change will be those receiving the funds of the loss and damage fund. How can we get to that concept? So I rely here on what is called a sufficientarian threshold notion of harm, according to which a person is harmed when they are pushed below a level sufficient to live a decent life, a decent and dignified flourishing life, thereby coming to live a life with intrinsically bad properties. So when we look at the negative effects of climate change on poor and developing countries, we can clearly see that they have been pushed by the effects of climate change below a relevant threshold to live a decent and dignified flourishing life. And why is it so? Because they live a life partly due to the effects of climate change, but also partly to other injustices that they suffer. They live a life with intrinsically bad properties. What does that mean? Well, it's a life that you don't have access to clean water, for instance. You don't have proper access to food, or people cannot enjoy a shelter to build a family, or even to just get proper sleep. At the same time, this subsidiarian threshold notion of harm connects with a human rights approach. And how does it do so? Well, according to my understanding, a person that suffers threshold harm, as I have just explained, also suffers an infringement of their human rights. And this is also this is clearly in the proper understanding of, in the common understanding of human rights, that those kind of features of a life must be respected in order to have your human rights respected. So the capabilities approach that I'm delineating here, or the subsidiarian threshold notion of harm, goes hand in hand with a understanding of human rights. And I was mentioning before the capabilities approach because I consider that the threshold notion of harm gives us a understanding of how we should understand the harm caused by the negative effects of climate change. And I was saying before that a person lives a life with threshold harm if they live a life with intrinsically bad properties. The capabilities approach gives us an idea of what kind of things constitute bad properties. So as you may know, Martin Nussbaum referred to this list of capabilities which determine when a person lives a flourishing life. And a person lives a flourishing life where they enjoy this list of capabilities: life, bodily health, bodily integrity, sense, imagination and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, play, relationship with other species, and control over one's environment, both at the political and the material level. Whenever a person has these capabilities affected in a negative way to the point that they don't reach a sufficiency threshold, then we say they suffer harm in the threshold sense that I was proposing before. Now, I have explained how the threshold notion of harm relates to the capabilities approach and also to the infringement of human rights. As I said, having one or various capabilities below a subsidiarian threshold is intrinsically bad for people, and in this sense constitutes threshold harm. But what does it mean to suffer from loss and damage, or what does it mean to suffer from loss and damage? Well, loss and damage occur precisely when, because of the negative effects, people experience life disruptions that push them below the sufficiency threshold. So suffering from loss and damage means suffering sufficientarian threshold harm. And the difference between those two concepts, between the concept of loss and the concept and damage, has to do with the temporal dimensions of these impairments in their life. When the impairment is permanent, we talk about losses, and when the impairment is temporary, we will be talking about damages. Just to give you an example, for instance, imagine a person that suffers from extreme rainfall precipitation in the region, and the houses get affected by this extreme extreme rainfall precipitation. So in this context, two things may happen. Either, for instance, their house can be repaired, and so the infringements on the human rights are only temporary, in which case we would be saying that they suffer a damage, or the houses have been completely destroyed, in which case we would be talking about losses. And the losses of, in this case, of their house may be related to some capabilities, such as the capability of, for instance, bodily health, because they require shelter, for instance, and the capability to be able to enjoy bodily health in this sense might be only temporarily affected, because they might be able to get shelter somewhere else, right? They can be relocated to a different location, but other capabilities might be permanently affected by these events, such as, for instance, their social how to say, like the social connections to the place where they live or to the people they share their life with. So if they need to be relocated somewhere else, all those things that relate to other capabilities that we saw before, for instance, with the capability of practical reason or the capability of affiliation, those things will be lost permanently, assuming that migrating to a different place will cause that loss. So this threshold notion of harm enables us to explain what is loss and damage, when loss and damage happens, and why it is bad for people. But what do we do about it? What I have proposed is different measures or different categories of measures to repair both losses and damages. So I have provided here in this table, as you can see, different methods to address loss and damage, and different categories of loss and damage too. So what I call economic damage, in particular, economic damage has to do with the example that I was bringing up before, has to do, for instance, with the loss of the shelter. And in order to address an economic damage in this context, what we need to do is repairing the material effects of climate change related to people's enjoyments of capabilities at a sufficient level. But other, as I was saying before, other things might be more difficult to repair, or even might be impossible to repair, in which case we would not be talking about damages anymore, or economic damages as I call them, but we will be talking about losses, and losses require what I call symbolic reparations. What do you do when you cannot repair anymore a loss? Well, in that case, there are different measures in which you at least can acknowledge the value of that thing that has been permanently lost. And that is what I refer to as victim-centered reparations. So victim-centered reparations look at acknowledging the value of what has been lost, and it refers to non-economic losses. Coming back to the example that I was giving before of this person that has lost their house in a permanent way, so they need to be relocated. They need to be relocated somewhere else. In those, imagine that this is not only about this person, but it's about the whole community that needs to be relocated somewhere else. In that case, a whole way of a whole social world has been lost, and a whole cultural community has been lost, in which case actions of remembrance or commemoration might be appropriate to reflect the value of what has been lost there. But not only that, we also need what I call agent-centered measures, which also affect a particular form of non-economic damage, which is how the relationship of respect among different communities with different responsibilities. So how that can be properly repaired, or at least restored to the highest degree. So in this case of this community that has been displaced due to climate change, we know that climate change has been caused by polluting actors, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later, but in this case, repairing the relationship of respect among those that have caused climate change and those that have suffered from the effect of climate change might require public apologies or at least statements of regret together with commitments of non-repetition. So, sorry. So this summarizes how I understand what we should understand by loss and damage, and also I have sketched briefly what kind of measures I consider appropriate for each kind of loss and damage. So now let's move to the principles of rectificatory climate justice. The principles of rectificatory climate justice aim at identifying who the duty bearers of rectification ought to be. And as I said before, rectificatory justice is a form of justice that aims to repair some negative state of affairs by providing some normative force to the historical origins of that state. The two principles that have been brought up in the literature of rectificatory justice, according to this definition, are the polluter-pays principle, and the polluter-pays principle is very simple. It says that those that have caused climate change should be the ones addressing climate change, and in this case, in particular, loss and damage caused by climate change. However, some other philosophers have proposed an alternative, and this alternative is the beneficiary-pays principle. The beneficiary-pays principle says that it's not those that have caused climate change, the ones that ought to address the problem, but rather those that have been benefiting from climate change. And here is not only a matter of identifying particular actors, but also providing a rationale for why those actors need to address climate change. So in the case of the polluter-pays principle, the polluter-pays principle says that the normatively relevant aspects for distributing responsibilities, the pollution, whereas in the case of the beneficiary-pays principle, the normative relevant aspects are the benefits that derive from the pollution. And so those are the two principles. And some philosophers have provided arguments for why we should prefer the beneficiary-pays principle over the polluter-pays principle due to various objections that the polluter-pays principle faces, which I will be explaining a little bit later. But for now, what I just want to say is that whereas some scholars have focused on the beneficiary-pays principle, I believe that there is a lot to do in order to explain the normative intuition behind the polluter-pays principle, and that is what I will be doing following here. So in this paper that you can see on the screen, I have explained why preferring the beneficiary-pays principle over the polluter-pays principle for the reasons that those philosophers have provided is wrong-headed. And so we should look into how to understand and justify the polluter-pays principle if we can do so. I already explained the intuitions behind the polluter-pays principle. So the idea is that many people, and here I'm bringing again the example of Vanessa Nakate, many people believe that the fact that the global north has caused climate change should be a reason for them to accept responsibility for the climate crisis. Now, there are, however, different objections raised against the polluter-pays principle. And if we cannot provide a rationale of the polluter-pays principle that meets these objections, then of course we should reject the principle. But I believe that we can provide a approach that meets this objection, and that's what I'm going to do now. But first, let's have a look at the objections. So we have the causation objection. The causation objection says that whereas we can clearly and confidently say that climate change has come with overall very negative effects for current generations and will cause negative effects for future generations. We cannot exactly point out at the particular effects of climate change. So where climate change has occurred. And why is this so? Well, because science cannot get that precise, basically. Although there has been a lot of improvements in what is called science of attribution, and the science of attribution is one that explains this connection between emissions and the particular effects of climate change. It's not fully developed yet. That is the causation objection. We will be looking at that a bit later. And the other two objections is what I call the excusable ignorance objection and the path dependencies objection. Now, if you're familiarized with the debates on moral responsibility, classical debates from moral philosophy, you will probably be able to identify what those objections point at. The excusable ignorance objection addresses the knowledge condition of moral responsibility. So the knowledge condition of moral responsibility tells us that for a person to be held morally responsible for a particular action or for the negative effects of a particular action, that person must have had knowledge available to them for knowing that the action that they were undertaking would cause certain negative effects. Now, in the context of climate change, many people believe that the knowledge condition cannot be met, or at least cannot be met for emissions happening until a certain point in time, and that point in time is 1990, with the first publication of the IPCC report. So until 1990, when the scientific community gathered together and explained to the world that climate change was a thing and would cause very negative effects for humanity, the political actors couldn't know that this was the case. That is the first objection. Of course, this objection applies only to 1990, and one might say that this was delayed for a couple of years more. So polluters cannot be made responsible for emissions happening until 1990. But one might even say that this cutoff date of 1990 ought to be extended further in the future because of the path dependencies objection. So the path dependencies objection relies on the alternative action condition of moral responsibility. And the alternative action condition of moral responsibility says that for a person to be held morally responsible for a particular action, that person must have had a different action that they could have undertaken instead of the one that they undertook. And in the case of climate change, this means that polluters must have had a alternative way of developing their countries, if we are thinking at the country level, than the one that they did. So, but the path dependencies objection tells us that that wasn't the case, that when countries knew in 1990 that their pollution would cause or would contribute to causing climate change, they couldn't switch immediately to a alternative socioeconomic path, because that would have caused massive harm to their communities and probably to the whole international community too. So they didn't have any other alternative action, at least not a very immediate one. So the cutoff date that we consider for polluters not to be more responsible for the emissions must be extended beyond 1990. Where that line is drawn is up for debate. Some people say that it must be around the first decade of the 2000s, but it might even go as far as today. So how do we provide an approach that can meet these objections and can justify the polluter pays principle? So in a nutshell, what I propose is the continuity account. And the continuity account says that polluters should bear the burdens of addressing loss and damage, because those duties, the duties of addressing loss and damage, stem from a previously unsatisfied duty of not infringing human rights. And this duty existed irrespective of the available knowledge and irrespective of the alternative paths available to polluters. This is the continuity account. So the idea is that polluters had certain duties not to engage in emission generating activities because they would infringe human rights, and the fact that they nonetheless engage in emission generating activities provides a reason for addressing loss and damage, namely for compensating those affected by the negative effects of climate change. And I will also explain how this account, so first the grounds for this account, and second how this account can meet the objections that I just mentioned before. So the continuity account is grounded in what John Gardner called the continuity thesis. The continuity thesis says that the grounds for rectification in tort law this is an account of tort law, are the rational reminders of previous unsatisfied moral duties. And he explained this with the example of breaching a promise when made to your kids about taking them to the beach. So imagine that, let's say, the father of the kid promises the kid to take them to the beach. And while imagine this is a philosophy professor, and while they are walking through campus and to take the car, to take the kid to the beach, it turns out that a student has an emergency and they require their assistance. So this professor helps the student, calls home, says that he cannot take the kids to the beach because they needed to assist this student due to this emergency. Now, what John Gardner says is that clearly there is some sense in which my broken promise continues to exert a hold over me after I break it. So the broken promise continues to exert a hold over the professor after the professor breaks this promise, and there is a sense in which it continues to shape what I am bound to do. There is an element of continuity here, something that carries through from my original obligation to my obligation now. So there is a element of continuity from the duty of taking your kids to the beach, given the promise that you made to them, to the obligation that you have to compensate them for not having taken them to the beach. How that compensation happens, again, is up for discussion. You may, I don't know, you may buy ice cream for them, and that might be enough to make up for the broken promise. You might need to take them at the next possible location to the beach, etc., etc. But in any case, there exists a duty to compensate your kid that is based on breaking on the broken promise, so on the initial obligation. And this element of continuity is constituted by the reasons in favor of acting in the ways required by the initial obligation. So the reason why you promise your kids the reason why you had to hold your promise to take your kids to the beach gets carried out to the next obligation to compensate them. Now, how does anything of these have to do with climate change? You might be questioning. Well, first of all, we need to look at the source of the duty. So what is the duty that polluters didn't satisfy that constitutes now the reason to compensate for the negative effects of climate change? And that duty is the duty to respect human rights. But in order to understand why the continuity account is able to meet the objections that I mentioned before, we also need to look into the characteristics of human rights. So human rights, according to Simon Kenny, are based on people's dignity. They are universal. That means that they, and this is very important, they are universal, which means that they hold at any time and at any point in space and time. They have high priority, And they represent moral thresholds, which means that thresholds below which people are not permitted to fall. We already talk about the relationship between human rights and moral thresholds when I was talking about the threshold notion of harm, and this idea of human rights also reflects it. So human rights acts as a reason, or acted as the reason to avoid climate change inducing activities. Here the idea is that even when polluters didn't know about the negative effects of climate change, and even if they knew but couldn't avoid violating or infringing human rights still acted as a reason to avoid climate change inducing activities, even if they couldn't act according to this reason. And this reason, that's the reason to avoid engaging in climate change inducing activities. And now, this reason to avoid engaging in climate change inducing activities gets carried out to a reason to rectify the negative effects of climate change on people's human rights when they are negatively affected by climate change. So there is an element of continuity from the reason to avoid engaging in climate change inducing activities due to the fact that people have human rights, to a reason to rectify the negative effects of climate change on people's human rights. And the important point is that this reason was this reason existed even regardless of the knowledge that people had about climate change, and regardless of the here you can see, and regardless of the actions or the alternative actions available to them. And it is for this reason that we can say that the continuity account can explain how the polluter pays principle can meet the objections. So the continuity account, just to repeat it, is the idea that the polluters who cause human rights infringement have now the duty to rectify human rights infringement by addressing loss and damage. There is, though, a limitation of this account, which ought to be found in a background theory of justice that I also embrace in this book. And the background theory is sufficientarianism. Sufficientarianism claims that what is important in terms of justice is whether people have enough to live decent lives. So here you shouldn't be confused between the sufficientarian threshold of harm and the sufficientarian and sufficientarianism. Those are two different things, even though they rely on similar intuitions. The sufficientarian threshold of harm, as you may remember, says that a person suffers harm in a threshold way when they are pushed below a certain threshold characterized by living a life with intrinsically bad properties. And the sufficientarianism says that people ought to have enough to live decent lives. Part of the reason for that is because otherwise they would be suffering sufficientarian threshold harm. But it is independent of that. So here the idea is that sufficientarianism acts as a background theory of distributive justice in the sense that any claim of rectificatory justice that I have been mentioning before, the claim that people ought to be compensated for the negative effect of climate change, should not make people fall below a sufficientarian threshold. So if we are in a situation in which a particular population ought to rectify climate injustice because of the emissions that they emitted, but they live below a sufficientarian threshold, then a sufficientarian theory of distributive justice would tell us that these people cannot or shouldn't fulfill their rectificatory justice duties. So this is the way in which we can avoid that rectificatory climate injustice causes further injustices for people living below a threshold. So now let's move into how this approach can be or can provide a understanding of a policy mechanism for loss and damage. Just to recall, I said before that 3 aspects are key for loss and damage, for the loss and damage fund. The first one is defining what will be financed and what we count as loss and damage and the measures necessary to address them. I have explained that when I explained the sufficientarian threshold of harm and also the measures for addressing loss and damage. Who will be the donors to this fund? I have explained this by referring to the polluter-pays principle. So it is those that cause emissions generating activities. It is them that need to provide reparations for loss and damage. Although I have not explained how loss and damage will be distributed, how loss and damage duties would be distributed among those that have caused climate change. And this is something that I'm going to address now because it concerns a more practical level. And third, how we will identify where loss and damage occur. So something that I have also not done so far. And I will not do it in great detail now because it requires getting into philosophy of science debate on the science of attribution, but I will be saying a few words about this. Actually, let's start there. So what I will be saying now is that in order to do these 2 things that we still need to do, so identify how loss and damage duties will be distributed and identify where loss and damage occur, we can rely on legal practices as guidance for our political theory. So when it comes to explaining how loss and damage will be identified, we need to bear in mind the conception objection that I mentioned before. So this idea that although we know that climate change will cause negative effects, we don't know where those negative effects will materialize. And climate scientists have been trying to address this problem by proposing a couple of approaches: the probabilistic event attribution and the storyline approach. It will take very long to explain these 2 approaches. It will take very long to explain these 2 approaches in detail. So let me just explain them very briefly. The probabilistic event attribution says that or what it does is comparing the probability of a certain extreme weather event happening in a world with climate change with the probability of this event happening in a world without climate change. And if this probability increases by X number, and the number there is debatable, but usually is considered to be doubling the risk of the event happening, then we would attribute the event to climate change and otherwise not. Whereas the storyline approach, what it does is looking into to what extent climate change has increased the magnitude of an event. So it's not about looking into the probability of the event, the whole event happening, but looking into how the magnitude has changed due to climate change. And it does so also by when comparing the world without climate change with the world without climate change, they isolate or they isolate the dynamic variables pertaining to the event and only look into the thermodynamic variables. It's a technical issue, difficult to explain. But what I want to say at this moment, because otherwise it will take me too long, is that a theory of rectificatory climate justice must give reasons for what of this approach or which one of these approaches we are going to use and why. And although I don't think I have conclusive reasons for preferring one over the other, I believe that the way we should make the decision is by looking at the adequacy for purpose view developed by Wendy Parker. So Wendy Parker proposed the adequacy for purpose view, and the idea is simple. The idea is that to decide whether, in her case, she was looking at in her case, she was looking at climate models and how climate models, which climate models we ought to use in different circumstances. And her idea is that you should use the climate model that fits the purpose that you have in the first place. So whereas some climate models might be, for instance, more helpful at representing certain locations over others, other climate models might be helpful for. So if a climate model, for instance, is particularly helpful for a particular location, and you are looking into the effect of climate change in that location, then you should choose that climate model and not a different climate model. That's basically the idea of adequacy for purpose view in climate models. Now, when it comes to rectifying climate injustice, we have two purposes. The first purpose for a policy mechanism for rectifying climate injustice is to get an as close as possible approximation of loss and damage caused by climate change. So identify where the harm happens. And in this case, or for this purpose, both the probabilistic event attribution and the storyline approach are helpful approaches, because they both provide the closest possible approximation of the effects of climate change in our world. At least that's what climate scientists say. But the second purpose of a policy mechanism for loss and damage is also provide normative relevance for the sources of the injustice, and that means assigning liability for emissions. And when it comes to when we are talking about liability here, I believe there are some reasons to think that the probabilistic event attribution is better suited than the storyline approach. And again, I don't think that this gives us conclusive reasons to believe that the probabilistic event attribution is overall a better approach for identifying loss and damage. But I do think that the fact that is adequate for or fitter for the purpose, both approaches might be adequate for the purpose, but the probabilistic event attribution might be fitter for the purpose. So the fact that it's fitted for the purpose gives us at least some reasons to prefer this approach. And why is it fitter for the purpose? Basically, because the probabilistic event attribution uses a reasoning that is that fits the purposes of liability as it is reflected in our legal practices. So think about, for instance, the Hennigan versus Manchester dry docks. In this case, the company was sued by their workers because of the presence of asbestos at the workplace. And of course, well, because they sue them because of the presence of asbestos, but in fact they sue them because it caused lung cancer, and this lung cancer could have been caused by the asbestos at the workplace. Although, of course, as we all know, lung cancer might be caused by other conditions, irrespective of the exposure to asbestos. Now, what the court said was that the asbestos had increased the probability of workers developing lung cancer by doubling the risk of them developing this cancer, and that was a reason enough to attribute the presence of asbestos or the lung cancer to the presence of asbestos, thereby making the company liable for the harm that the workers suffered. And cases in which this reasoning has been followed, we can find many cases in which this reasoning has been followed in tort law. And what I argue is that these kind of legal practices give us reasons to think that it is the probabilistic event attribution, or the reason behind the probabilistic event attribution, the one that is fittest for the purpose of attributing liability. Now, let me get into the second issue that I wanted to mention, when it comes to the distribution of responsibility among polluters. So I have given reasons for supporting the polluter pays principle. And as I said, the polluter pays principle distributes the responsibility according to the pollution. However, again, we cannot know how. So we can know that overall emissions have caused climate change, and climate change overall causes negative effects, but we don't know exactly which emissions, so which polluters have caused which negative effects. And that inability to connect the negative effects of emissions, with particular emissions is also a challenge for distributing responsibility among polluters. But also in this case, legal practice can give us a guidance for developing the loss and damage fund. In this case, by providing the so-called market share mechanism. So the market share mechanism has also been used in different court cases, and the idea is that you may have a company or various companies distributing a certain product that ends up causing certain harm. So there are various cases involving, for instance, pregnant women who took a medicine that then ended up affecting the fetus. But there were many companies distributing this product. So those women affected by the product couldn't pinpoint or couldn't point to a particular company that have caused the harm to them, because there were many of them that have distributed this product, and they also didn't know which company they bought the medicine from. So how do we connect here the harms that these women suffer or the fetus suffer with the sources or the particular sources of the problem, meaning the particular companies? Well, the solution that has been found in courts is basically saying that even though we cannot point at the particular company causing this particular harm, we can still hold companies responsible for the share of the share of the market. So for how many medicine they put out there in the market. How does this translate into the context of climate change? Even though we cannot say that a particular polluter has caused a particular negative effect, we can still hold them responsible for the proportion of the emissions that they have put out there in the atmosphere. And this is another case in which legal practice can guide our intuitions concerning the loss and damage fund. So how to distribute responsibility among the polluters. And here is not because legal practice is, so my intuition is not so much, or my approach is not so much that legal practice is per se correct, but the fact that there is this legal practice reflects that our social practices are of the sort that our legal practices guide the intuitions behind, or our moral intuitions behind how to solve these kind of problems. And with this, I'm approaching the end. So if I may just recap the ideas that I have been putting here. My account of rectifying climate injustice provides a definition of loss and damage that relies on the capabilities approach and says that people that are pushed below a sufficiency threshold of each element of their flourishing life suffer from loss and damage, and that constitutes an infringement of the human rights, that it is polluters who ought to pay for the negative effects of their emissions, because the reasons they have for avoiding climate change inducing activities, namely emissions in the first place, now still have a pull in the form of compensatory duties or rectificatory duties for loss and damage. And third, I have explained how we can interpret attribution science and also the distribution of responsibility among polluters following the mechanisms provided by legal practice. And that would contribute to build a policy mechanism for loss and damage. So that is all. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you for your lecture. Now, Professor Marco Azevedo, at Unisinos, will discuss your presentation.
Hi. It's okay?
Marco, please. Yes. Perfect.
Thank you for participating as a commentator of Laura's book and presentation. Laura, first, let me introduce to you quickly. I'm a doctor, I'm a physician, so I'm on duty. I'm near São Leopoldo, a couple of, half an hour from São Leopoldo. And sorry for the people, my students and all people that are in present in São Leopoldo for not be with you now. I had some problems of connection problems, and fortunately, Denis said me to use my telephone, and it is on my right, so you will see me in profile. And I'm going to read a text that I wrote after I made a quick reading of your book, Laura. And now I heard and saw your presentation and check the ideas. And I try to read and comment and your contribution. And first, let me begin that I found your book very insightful, philosophically rich, and actually it is not philosophical book. It's a book on law and political science, etc. And so it's beyond my expertise. But I think you offer a very good normative framework for thinking about loss and damage. Your approach is, as you said, grounded in a capabilities-based threshold account of harm, a historical conception of rectificatory justice. Well, I think that the central argument in favor of rectificatory rather than merely compensatory understanding of justice in the context of climate harm is sound and timely. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to delve deeper into other ideas explored in your book, such as your defense of the polluter pays principle that I heard now, versus beneficiary principle, other legal issues in international law or tort law is different from us. My readings of this and other ideas were superficial, so I will focus my brief comments on two specific areas of the book that speaks to my own philosophical interests. First, I will comment and reflect on the sufficientarian approach to loss and damage, and on how we should conceptualize harm in this context. Second, I will address the issue of states as the proper duty bearers and individuals as the right holders. On the second point, I hope to suggest that while individuals may indeed hold reparative rights when actual harm has occurred, in the case of nations, especially those whose political aims include the protection of future generations, these collectives may already possess present rights vis-a-vis states that represent peoples and governments with a major share of historical responsibility for the climate crisis. Let me develop those ideas. Let me begin with the reflection on the notion of harm and the threshold that define loss and damage in your sufficientarian framework, what you call minimal capability-based account of loss and damage. Your approach, drawing on the capabilities tradition and the Human Rights Foundation, propose that harm occurs when climate change, if I understood right, cause people's capability to fall below a morally relevant threshold of sufficiency. In this view, duties of rectification arise when individuals are pushed below that line, as the figure in your presentation, the man falling down. While this model is elegant and pragmatically oriented, I would like to raise a point of what can be a subtle disagreement. In my view, the threshold that matters is not simply one making a shift from a previous state of general capabilities to a damaged state, but rather I see it as a moral boundary that separates those people who live under decent conditions of well-being and those who fall below that line, those whom we might call the worst off. And in this sense, harm should be understood more generally as a serious disadvantage that place an actual person below the level of a sufficiently good life, and which can be imputed to a responsible agent, whether an individual or government or state, for some specified wrongful action or omission. I see you will not disagree, but the difference is maybe about what we understand by well-being. Let me explain that. There is, of course, a long-standing debate about how to define this threshold. García, Portela, you seem to follow a capability-based approach. That is, in philosophy, we call this a kind of objective list approach in the spirit of Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen. An approach that Derek Parfit famously described it as relying on lists of objective goods. And I respect this tradition, but I believe that the standard of human well-being is better captured either by a modern form of hedonism, as defended, for example, by Fred Feldman and Roger Crisp, or by what I prefer to call, this is my theory, a four-dimensional view of human well-being that is plural, that supports a plural account, but it's not exactly an objective list account, because it includes subjective issues. But I would try to present a sketch of this. Although this is not the place to defend my view in detail, let me simply state that in my account, well-being consists in a condition that combines four fundamental elements. Two of those elements are experiential, that is a life of sufficient enjoyment, and a life marked by emotional stability, which we may loosely call happiness. So two domains that are experiential, and two objective domains. A healthy life, so I think, I'm a physician, so I think health is important. And I think health is important for well-being, not as Aristotle, for example, says, that it is a good of the body and it is second-hand, of a second-hand importance. I think it's of primary importance. So I think a healthy life is important, and a life with valuable accomplishments. So it's different from the hedonists. This is a kind of mixed account. So dependent of if I am right, I'm only presenting a sketch of this. The idea is that capabilities may be understood as means for that, more in general. So a minimally decent life, I understood as a life that satisfies these four dimensions to a reasonable degree. Accordingly, individuals have rights not only to outcomes, but to the means that enable them to realize such a life, of course. And these are not merely individual claims addressed to other individuals, because they are social rights, that is, rights addressed to political community as such, and thus to states, and understood as the institutional embodiment of that community. On this basis, climate harms encompass not only actual interference with present functioning, but also impediments to the attainment of sufficient well-being, especially when they undermine or destroy the means by which individuals could pursue such well-being. Climate-related loss and damage should therefore be understood as including direct impacts on health, enjoyment, happiness, and the pursuit of valuable accomplishments, and not as a result of private acts, but also of public policies enacted by governments or states that produce such serious disadvantage. Okay, but this is not a problem, and actually probably is not a disagreement. The point is how we deal with this philosophical difficult problem. That is, how should we understand the normativity of future climate-related harms? Those that are predictable, but not yet realized. After all, how can people who do not yet exist be harmed? We can, of course, predict a harm to someone real already born, but it is conceptually odd and weird, let us remember Mackey, to say that a non-existent person could hold an actual claim against a future outcome. I think it's not possible. It's unsensible. And so I have a problem because I agree with you, maybe with a different explanation of well-being, but it's similar in general. But I think we have a problem to explain why the future generations can be harmed and how they could have rights, actual rights against us, against the previous people, against the governments, against the states. And I think it's maybe more a philosophical problem than a practical problem. But my suggestion is that present duties of government that aim at benefit future individuals are best interpreted not as duties to those future individuals, but rather as actual claims held by present-day people, namely the members of a nation or political collective with a shared long-term interest. The well-being of future generations is a core interest, indeed an intrinsic one of any such collective. There is no meaningful idea of a nation that does not aim at its own continuation over future. Thus, nations have a present interest in the well-being of their future members. So it follows that nations can be harmed today by actions or policies that cause environmental change, which are plausibly or predictably detrimental to their descendants. The harm is real and present, not because it is experienced by future individuals, but because it undermines the long-term integrity and aims of existing collective agents. So let me move forward about rights or benefits for future generations. And who are the actual right holders? This brings me to the second topic I wish to address, the questions of duty bearers and right holders in the architecture of climate justice. You adopt what I believe is a very thoughtful and well-argued position. You combines the view that individuals are the recipients of climate justice with the idea that states are the primary duty bearers. I find this overall framework compelling, coherent, but I would like to offer a few comments that may help to refine and further articulate this. As you acknowledge, individuals are natural candidates for being the holders of moral and legal rights, particularly when harm has already occurred. However, you also anticipate the difficulty of ascribing rights to individuals who do not yet exist, the topic I just mentioned here, those future persons who will be affected by climate change. As I've already suggested, this is a problem not only of justice, but of moral metaphysics. How can someone who does not yet exist be the bearer of a right now? And if not, to whom are current duty bearers, such as states, morally accountable when they are asked to protect future lives? You handle this challenge by appealing to collective responsibility and exploring two theoretical strategies. The one entity strategy, which treats nations as continuous transgeneration agents, and the two groups strategy, where current individuals are seen as vicariously responsible for the wrongs of their predecessor. Both approaches are plausible, but I want to propose a further clarification or perhaps a shift in emphasis. As I argued earlier, rather than attributing present rights to future individuals, we should recognize that the appropriate right holders are existing collective agents, nations, peoples, or political communities, whose identity and moral interest include a commitment to their own long-term continuity. Let me stop for a moment, because I think this is a very important issue for the human rights tradition, because we have two different kind of explanations of rights applied to holders. First, I will call the liberal tradition. Hobbes, for example, is an old representative of this philosophical view, that is, the recipients of rights. Hobbes, of course, didn't call in rights, but the recipients of rights are individuals. So collectives are only sums of individuals, groups of individuals. I think the other position is Rousseau's, for example, that think that there are true collectives, and the collectives are not, we cannot reduce metaphysically a collective, this kind of collective, to their individuals. This is a kind of collective we have when we talk about nations, for example, or people, because we have people that are dead, people that will live tomorrow. Today, for example, we are Brazilian, but today are several people that are in birth that are beginning to live now and ceasing to exist today. And so the entities or the individuals that compose those collectives change. For many, many years, I thought that this approach of the metaphysics of collectives were wrong. I were a kind of Nozick defensor of individuals are the right holders, and this is the same view I apply to Hobbes. But now I'm persuaded that we have to talk about true collectives, and so we have to open the door for the idea of rights attributed to collectives. Of course, this is a disputable view, but if we accept my approach, nations understood in this way are individuals that have not only interests, but can support or bear hold rights. Because nations have a present interest in avoiding climate harm, not just because they care about individual lives in the abstract, but because their own political and moral projects depend on the protection of their future viability. If this is true, then climate injustice occurs not only when identifiable individuals are harmed today, but also when the collective capacity of nations to safeguard their future members is undermined. This makes those nations right holders in a very real and present sense. Consequently, states, as the institutional representatives of nations, are not only duty bearers to individual citizens, but also to the collective identity and continuity of the political community itself. This model preserves the normative force of intergenerational justice while avoiding the metaphysical difficulties of grounding rights in the non-existent individuals. This is my suggestion. But this is my comments. I think your book is very insightful, as I said. I didn't read it all. I make a quick reading for participating in this conference. And well, those comments are, of course, of my preference. your approach about the threshold conception in the sufficientarian conception, I think I have strong sympathy with this approach. So thank you for your presentation. Thank you, Laura. And thank you for the audience too, for being here in discussion with us.
So Laura, your reply, please.
Yeah, I can provide a very brief reply since I'm also looking forward to the Q&A. So maybe one clarification. I don't think my view needs to hold that the duties we have towards future people, even though the topic of the book is rather the infringements of rights of currently living people, but you are right that this affects the future, right? If I say we have reasons to avoid climate-inducing activities because they will affect future people, then it does have that implication. But I don't think I need to say that currently living people have, that future people have rights in the present vis-a-vis us. It is enough to say that because they will have rights, in the future, we have a duty to prevent climate change. And why is that so? Because we know that they will have interests. We know that they will have certain interests, and the interests can be tracked by the capabilities. And because we know that their future existing rights limits the kind of actions that we can permissibly undertake for not violating their future rights. So I think that would be the way I would answer to the first point. And the second point, I found it very interesting. I think it's very insightful, and I need to think a little bit more about it, especially the idea of states being not only the duty bearers, but also the recipients of climate justice. I think that my view can make sense of that idea in an indirect way by saying that if we understand states as a political community, and this political community ought to be considered the recipient of justice, and that is, if you like, a bit of a metaphysical position that I don't necessarily embrace in the book, but one could say that because of the relevance of that political community for individuals, states have are in an indirect way also recipients of climate justice because of the relevance of the political community for individuals. I think that those are the two reactions to the points you made, and thank you again for having a quick look at the book. It's very impressive.
I would have 30 minutes for questions. Questions can be in English or Spanish. Professor Laura is Spanish. So,
I'll start with this. I think
please,
a simple question. Thank you, Laura, for your presentation. It was excellent. I would like to ask you about, I don't remember exactly the term you used, but the symbolic retribution. I think it's a subject particularly interesting, and for Brazilians, which have several indigenous communities which are not do not fall within the scope of damages. They are losing effectively their living, their community, their culture, and I found a little bit less than I wanted your reply to those your proposals for symbolic retribution. I mean, I know that in Australia, for instance, they acknowledge the indigenous people's culture and their worldviews and so on, but they continue to have an unjust relationship with the indigenous people. And in Brazil also, and if we are being just, with the rest of the global north continues to have an unjust relationship with those peoples, and also with poorer countries. So I would like you to, if you can, provide a little bit more of information about that subject. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. It's a very important question. So maybe two things. The first one is that I believe that symbolic reparations is the term that I use, are not enough, let's say, for repairing losses and damages caused, in this case, to indigenous people. What symbolic reparations, and particularly victim-centered symbolic reparations, aims to do is to try to repair as much as possible their lost history, if you like, or the loss of the community that existed and so on. Now, is that enough? No, that's not enough. And that's the reason why we also have other kinds of reparations, but they also have their limits. And I believe also that the symbolic reparations need to come also with a commitment of non-repetition. How that commitment of non-repetition is displayed is also a question to debate. But in any case, the commitment of non-repetition, I mean, now I'm talking off the top of my head, but I'm thinking that it needs to go together with actual measures not to engage in the activities that have been causing the harms to those communities. So in a way, reparations for loss and damage for the harm that has occurred needs to come together with measures of mitigation, if you like, to properly reflect the value of the symbolic compensation. And in this sense, we talk about different kinds of climate policies, mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. But to some extent, they are related, right? Because to provide proper reparations, you also need to commit yourself not to repeat, which falls more into the category of mitigation. So to say very briefly, what I would say is that the first thing is symbolic reparations is not the only thing, and the second thing is to avoid the kind of problems that you were pointing to, loss and damage need to be connected with measures of mitigation too.
Thank you.
Any questions? Lucas, any question? No, Alessandra. Please.
Thank you, Professor Laura, for your presentation. It was too enlightening. My question is related to the last part about the framework to address loss and damage based on legal practice. And according to what I understood, the framework that you propose, it's more related to private characters and industries. I was thinking about the states as also duty bearers, considering that they support a certain kind of energetic system based on fossil fuels, which is a critique of Henry Schule that he calls sovereignty externalities that impacts communities. And this market related to fossil fuels generally are supported by states, or generally states have participation in this industry. So how we will address the responsibility of states based on your framework? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So this is something I haven't mentioned in the presentation, and I should have, but actually Marco Antonio has mentioned it in his comments. in the book, I rely on the idea of states being the relevant duty bearers. So that is my my take on it. And so I would say that it is states those that owe reparations to those affected negatively by climate change, negatively affected by climate change, and that also that doesn't mean that companies can also be held liable for the emissions and so on and so forth. But it would be the responsibility of the state to regulate companies so that they take responsibility for the emissions. So I understand the states to be the relevant agents, in short.
Professor Lucas?
So first of all, thank you, Laura. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is, when you put on the two principles, the polluter pays principle, and then the benefactor pays
Beneficiary,
principle.
yeah.
Beneficiary, yeah. Sorry. I was thinking like, when you think of those who cause the damage or the injustice, I mean, it's very tangible in some ways that you can look at people and see, oh, those are the polluters. But then we think about those who benefit from the damage or the injustice. I mean, this is not like very tangible. Like you cannot see many times who are the people who benefit from the damage and injustice. So how can you imagine this kind of problem? Because I think in law, environmental law, maybe they took the principle of the polluter because it's very clear and you can point out people. But then when you think about those who benefit from the damage, I mean, this is very indirect. Like you cannot look at out there and see who are the people who benefit from injustice. So I don't know if you have any idea about how to manage this kind of problem.
Yeah, well, I think you spotted on one of the problems that I also see with the beneficiary-based principle. So one of the problems of the beneficiary-based principle is that, I mean, intuitively, we can say, for instance, I don't know, the hospitals I have access to are beneficial for me, right? And we have this level of healthcare system, at least in Europe, because the levels of development we could achieve are due to climate change inducing activities. So in an indirect way, we benefit from climate change inducing activities. But as you rightfully identify, we do not only benefit from climate change inducing activities in this way. There are many reasons why we may have this healthcare system. Not all of them are just, but some are just. So I don't know, one might say hard work, for instance. People have put hard work to build this health system. Or more unjust ones, colonialism. Colonialism has also enable us to have this healthcare system. It's unjust, but it's not climate change necessarily. So how do we disaggregate all the sources from which we are benefiting? And I also think that, I mean, I agree with you, basically is my answer, that the beneficiary-based principle has another question to answer. So if you are interested in this issue in the paper that I mentioned during the talk, I basically compare the two principles. And I basically say, look, the polluter-based principle suffers from the same problems, or the other way. The beneficiary-based principle actually suffers from the same problems of the benefit of the polluter-based principle, and probably it suffers more. And one of them, I think I mentioned that in the paper, is the one you were explaining.
Okay. Professor Wilson? Okay. Laura, I am Wilson. I am a professor here in Unisinos in the law school. And first of all, congratulations for your presentation and for your book. I accessed this today, and it's very interesting, the summary of the topics that you developed here. For me, it's very interesting, the chapter 6, 5, and you when you study the attribution science. I think the attribution science is an important aspect in this climate justice, because when we know
exactly what is the line of the pollution and where are the polluters. I think it is especially important to establish the responsibility. For this, for my curiosity, do you think that when we develop more the attribution science, we can actually develop a more consciousness, especially about the great polluters, the fuel, oil, and other enterprise that we have. Because here in Brazil, we have a lot of processes in the justice for the resolution of these situation about the climate situations. But in my opinion, I think the judiciary is not the correct arena to resolve this situation, this problem. What do you think about this?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's a very interesting question. So I want to say two things. The problem of addressing, if I understood you correctly, the problem of addressing a particular company, for instance, an oil company, and point to them as the responsible agent for a particular harm, right? That is the issue. So the problem there is that when we have a harm caused by climate change, the company may have contributed and has contributed a lot for climate change, but the negative effects of climate change in a particular location are the result of all emissions emitted in the past and in the present. The fraction of responsibility of that company is minimal. And that is the reason why, as you said, the legal mechanisms addressing this kind of particular agents, even if they were successful in legal terms, could only make those companies responsible for a minimal fraction of the damages that they have, that the people are suffering. And that is the reason why I believe that what we need is a international mechanism to deal with the damages and then distribute the responsibility at the global level, because the problem has been caused at the global level. I'm also skeptical about and about legal cases holding particular companies responsible. And recently there has been the case of Lulia versus RWE, I think, the famous case of the Peruvian farmer who sued a oil company, a German oil company, for the damages in their farm. They lost it also, and they lost it partly because of this, because the court agreed that the contribution of the company is minimal to the damages that the Peruvian farmers suffer, because it's caused by overall climate change.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Any question? Well, Professor Laura, thank you very much for your presentation. Very impressed. Your book on rectifying climate justice. Congratulations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. And I hope next time I can pay a visit to Brazil.
Okay. We wait.
Ciao, ciao. Ciao, ciao.